Jake Dawson stood on the edge of his grandfather's ranch, the wind biting through the night air. The dry desert stretched out before him, endless and silent, as if the whole world had fallen asleep. The old wooden fence, which had stood tall for generations, creaked in the breeze. His grandfather's ranch was all Jake had left now, after Eli Dawson's mysterious death just a few days ago. The place felt empty. Jake had no idea why his grandfather had passed, but he was determined to keep the ranch alive, even if it meant handling things on his own. But tonight, something was different. Jake felt it in his gut, an uneasy sense that something or someone was watching him. He wasn't alone out here. A faint humming sound grew louder above him, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He spun around just in time to see a dark shape, barely visible against the star-filled sky, moving toward him. A spacecraft, small, sleek, and with no visible lights. The sound of its engines hummed softly, then it vanished. It was cloaked, hidden in the night, and Jake's heart raced. He had heard stories about cloaking technology, advanced technology used by people he couldn't even begin to understand. Before Jake could process what had just happened, the ship appeared again, a small flash of light illuminating the desert floor as it landed nearby. The sound of the ship's landing gears echoed in the silence, and the dust settled slowly around the ship's feet. Jake's instincts kicked in. He wasn't foolish enough to approach just yet, but something about the whole situation felt off. He grabbed his old laser revolver from his holster and started toward the ship, his boots crunching on the dry ground. His heart pounded louder than his footsteps. As Jake got closer, he saw the figure stepping out from the ship's dark shadows. A woman? No, not a woman. She looked human, but the way she moved, the way her eyes glowed faintly, told him she was anything but. She was an alien, tall with skin a soft green, and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark, like they had seen centuries pass. Her long hair shimmered in the moonlight, and even though she looked fragile, there was a strength in the way she carried herself. She was beautiful, but also dangerous. "Are you?" Jake didn't know what to say. He'd never seen anything like this before. The woman looked at him with deep, sorrowful eyes, as if she had seen too much pain to ever be truly happy again. Then she spoke, but it wasn't in a language Jake recognized. I don't understand," Jake muttered, his finger tight around the revolver's trigger. She took a step closer, reaching out a hand. The air around her seemed to shimmer with energy, a soft, glowing aura surrounding her body. Then, as if reading Jake's mind, she said in perfect English, "I need your help." Before Jake could respond, a loud, almost metallic roar cut through the night. The ground vibrated, and Jake spun around, eyes widening. A fleet of ships, much larger than the one the woman had arrived in, appeared from the shadows. They were no longer cloaked, their sharp edges and glowing lights marking them as enemies. Jake's heart raced. These were no ordinary ships. They were heavily armed and coming fast. The woman was in danger. And from the looks of it, they weren't here for a peaceful talk. The ships descended slowly, their lights illuminating the desert, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for Jake and the woman. Then a loud voice rang through the air, amplified by speakers built into the ships. "Zarika, surrender now, and we may let him live." The woman, Zarika, closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning some kind of inner strength. Jake didn't understand who she was or why she was here, but he knew one thing for sure. If these people were after her, they were dangerous, and if he didn't act fast, they'd both be in deep trouble. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. Without thinking, he pulled his revolver free and aimed it toward the nearest ship. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not letting you take her." The voice on the ship's intercom scoffed. "You're just a human. You have no idea what you're up against. This doesn't concern you." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories about humanity being outmatched by alien forces, stories of technologically superior species wiping out entire civilizations. But Jake had grown up on his grandfather's ranch, a place where you had to stand your ground, and he wasn't about to let anyone walk over him, human or alien. Zerika looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, this time with more force. You don't know what you're dealing with. These are bounty hunters, trained killers. They've come for me because I hold something they want. Jake frowned. Something. What is it? What do they want from you? Zerika hesitated, and Jake could see a flicker of fear in her eyes for the first time. My people, my race, they were once powerful, but we are no more. Now, they hunt the last of us. Then I guess we'll just have to stop them, Jake said, determination flooding his voice. Zerika stepped closer, her hand almost reaching out to him. You don't understand. You cannot fight them. They are too strong. I don't care, Jake said. I'll protect you. My grandfather didn't leave me this ranch for nothing. But as Jake spoke, the ships were closing in fast. He could see the glow of their weapons charging up, ready to fire. Get inside, now, Zerika urged, her voice trembling with urgency. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran toward the ranch house, knowing that his life, and perhaps the future of humanity, was about to change forever. Behind him, the faint glow of the alien ships followed, like a dark storm on the horizon. And in that moment, Jake realized one thing. This was just the beginning. Jake had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. The strange woman, Zerika, had insisted that they head into the ranch house immediately. She looked over her shoulder constantly, as though expecting the ships to follow them at any moment. Jake didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. His world was never going to be the same again. Inside the ranch house, the warm glow of the lanterns felt like a faint reminder of the life Jake had always known. The smell of leather, dust, and the old wooden beams that held the roof up. It was familiar, but everything else felt different. He glanced at Zerika, who seemed far more alert than anyone should be after a near-death experience. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, she kept scanning the windows, her alien eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They'll be coming soon, Zerika said softly, her voice tight. We need to move quickly. Jake took a deep breath. All right, what are we running from? Zerika stopped pacing and turned to face him. Her expression softened just a little, but the sadness in her eyes never left. My people were once the most powerful species in this galaxy, she began, her voice distant. We had knowledge, technology, and power beyond anything you could imagine. But it came at a cost. Our power was too much, too dangerous. There were those who didn't want us to exist anymore. And we were hunted down. Jake stood still, trying to wrap his mind around what she was saying. Your people? Who were they? Zerika hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her words slow and measured. We were known as the Saran. Our civilization spanned across many star systems. We could manipulate energy, control the elements, even bend time itself in small ways. But we were not invincible. There were enemies, other species who feared us, who saw our power as a threat. So, they wiped us out. They erased our history, our language, everything. Except for me. Jake sat down at the worn wooden table, processing what Zerika was telling him. The weight of her words sank in, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for her. So you're the last one? He asked quietly. Zerika nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. I am, and that is why they want me. The people hunting me. They believe I hold something that can make them unstoppable. Something I don't fully understand, but I was born to protect. Jake's head spun with the enormity of it all. His grandfather's ranch, a place that had always been quiet and peaceful, was now the center of something he couldn't even begin to grasp. My grandfather, Jake muttered, looking down at the table. He must have known. Why didn't he tell me about any of this? Zerika sat across from him, folding her hands in front of her. Your grandfather was more than just a rancher, Jake. He was part of a secret alliance, one that protected my people and the knowledge of the Xaran. He was one of the few who helped shield me from those who wanted to take my life. He kept me hidden for years, and I think he knew that one day they would come for me. Jake's stomach twisted. His grandfather had always been a man of mystery, but he never imagined anything like this. Eli Dawson, the old cowboy, had been hiding an alien princess, a powerful being who was the last of her kind. Jake couldn't believe it. He kept all this secret from me, Jake said softly. But why didn't he tell me before? Why leave me in the dark? Zerika looked down, as if she knew the answer but didn't want to say it. He was protecting you, Jake. The less you knew, the safer you would be. If they knew you were involved, they would come for you too. Jake ran his hands through his hair. The weight of the situation was too much for him to bear, but it also made sense in a strange way. His grandfather had always been cautious, always telling him to stay away from certain things, certain people. Now Jake understood why. Zerika stood up and walked to the window, peering through the dusty blinds. It's only a matter of time before they find us. They have ways of tracking me, cloaking devices, drones, and even worse. But we have one advantage. Jake stood up and walked over to her. What's that? Zerika turned to face him, her eyes glowing brighter now. You. They underestimated humans. They think you're weak, primitive. But your people have something that no one else has. Resilience. It's something that Xaran never could understand. No matter how advanced we became, we always struggle to overcome our own flaws. But you humans, you have the strength to fight, to adapt. Jake blinked, taken aback by her words. You're saying humans are better than your people. Zerika nodded slowly. In some ways, yes. You have something we lost. You have the will to survive, to protect each other no matter the odds. And that's why I need your help. Together, we can stop them. Jake didn't know what to say. He had always seen himself as just a cowboy, someone who lived out here in the wild, far from the chaos of the world. But this was bigger than anything he could have imagined. He was about to step into a war far beyond anything his grandfather had prepared him for. How do we stop them? Jake asked, his voice firm now. How can I help you? Zerika smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. There is a hidden power inside you, Jake. Something your grandfather must have known about. Something that connects you to the Xaran. And I will teach you how to unlock it. Jake felt a chill run through him, but also a spark of determination. He didn't know what this power was, or how he could possibly unlock it. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let his grandfather's legacy die without a fight. Together, Jake and Zerika would have to figure out how to face the greatest threat humanity had ever known. And they would have to do it fast, because the enemy was already on their doorstep. The ranch, once a quiet place of solitude, had now become ground zero for a battle that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. The quiet night around Jake's ranch was shattered by the distant hum of approaching engines. Jake and Zerika stood by the window, watching the horizon. The calm that had settled over them was now replaced with an unsettling tension. Zerika's face was serious. Her eyes narrowed as she peered into the dark. They're coming, she said quietly, her voice tense. We don't have much time. Jake's grip tightened on the handle of his revolver, the same weapon that had been passed down through his family. A symbol of his heritage, now felt heavy in his hand. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he couldn't back down. He wasn't going to let anyone take this place, and he sure wasn't going to let them take Zerika. Outside, the first signs of trouble became apparent. The ground vibrated as large engines roared to life, their sounds growing louder. Jake had been around enough to recognize the low growl of alien ships, the same ships he had seen earlier, the ones that had tried to take Zerika. They were back, and this time they weren't going to leave without a fight. Zerika turned to face Jake, her eyes glowing faintly as she spoke. They've sent the bounty hunters. They're here for me. And the artifact. We have to fight back, or we'll lose everything. Jake's heart raced. He knew they were outnumbered, but there was no turning back now. His grandfather had left him this ranch, and he wasn't about to lose it without a fight. What do we do? Jake asked, his voice tight with determination. Zerika's expression hardened. We hold them off as long as we can. I'll do what I can, but you need to be ready. They won't go down easily. The hum of the approaching ships grew louder, and then, just like that, they appeared. Cloaked ships emerged from the shadows, their engines glowing with a cold, eerie light. As the ships came into full view, Jake could see the deadly weapons mounted on their hulls. These weren't just ordinary spacecraft. They were warships, equipped with everything needed to take down a small army. Jake's eyes scanned the land around him. There was no way they could fight these ships head-on. He needed a plan, a way to use the terrain to his advantage. He had fought in skirmishes before, but this was different. The aliens had technology far beyond anything he'd ever seen. Quick, Zerika said, snapping him out of his thoughts. We need to take cover. The two of them ran through the house, gathering whatever weapons they could find. Zerika's powers would help, but Jake knew it would take more than just her abilities to stop these attackers. They needed a strategy. Jake led Zerika out to the back of the house, where the barn still stood. The old structure was sturdy, and Jake figured it would provide some cover. He checked the old lock on the barn door and quickly shoved it open. Inside, the barn was a mess of old farming equipment and tools, but it also had a small stash of weapons his grandfather had kept hidden for emergencies. There were old blasters, explosives, and a few high-powered rifles. Jake didn't know how to use half of it, but he wasn't going to stand there and figure it out. They needed to act fast. He handed Zerika one of the blasters. Use this, he said. I'll set up the other gear. Zerika nodded, her face determined. You'll need to be careful. The bounty hunters have cloaking technology. They'll be hard to spot. Jake cursed under his breath. He knew it would be tough, but he wasn't going to back down. Then I'll have to make sure I'm faster than them. The barn doors creaked open, and they both stepped outside, ready for the fight ahead. The alien ships hovered over the ranch now, their massive forms casting long, menacing shadows across the land. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sky above him seemed filled with the enemy. Suddenly, without warning, the ships fired. The ground shook violently as blasts of energy rained down from the sky. Jake dove for cover behind a stack of hay bales, his heart racing. The explosion sent dirt and debris flying. And for a moment, everything was chaos. Zerika stood beside him, her face a mask of concentration. She raised one hand, and the air around them seemed to ripple. Jake watched in awe as the energy from the blast seemed to slow down, twisting and curving around her. She was deflecting the shots, using her powers to redirect the blasts away from them. Stay low, Zerika shouted. They'll keep targeting us until we make a move. Jake nodded, then peered around the hay bale to get a better look at the ships. He could see the outlines of enemy soldiers beginning to drop down to the ground from the ships. These weren't just bounty hunters. These were soldiers, equipped with heavy armor and weapons. They were coming. Jake could feel his pulse quicken as he grabbed the high-powered rifle. He aimed carefully at the first soldier who appeared, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot rang out, and the soldier dropped to the ground, a cloud of dust rising around him. Nice shot, Zerika said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Jake didn't have time to reply. More soldiers appeared, and they were coming faster now. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the staccato bursts of energy weapons, and the explosions that rocked the ground beneath their feet. Jake moved quickly, firing again, taking out another soldier. But there were too many of them. He couldn't hold them off forever. We need to get to the old shed, Zerika said urgently, pulling him toward a small structure near the edge of the ranch. It's our only chance. Jake nodded. They ran, dodging blasts as they went, and made their way to the shed. Inside, Jake quickly set up explosives he had found earlier. "This should buy us some time," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Zerika turned to face him, her eyes fierce. "You're not just fighting for me, Jake. You're fighting for everyone. If we lose this battle, we lose everything." Jake swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his weapon. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, but there was no turning back now. The battle had begun. As the explosions rocked the ranch, Jake and Zerika moved quickly, darting from one cover to another. The ground shook beneath their feet, the sound of gunfire and blasts all around them. There was no time to think about the odds. They had one shot at this. The night sky was alive with light now, filled with the brilliant flashes of battle. Jake was starting to understand what it meant to truly fight for survival. The stakes were high, and they were up against enemies who would stop at nothing to win. But Jake wasn't going to let them take what was his. Not without a fight. With a final, determined look at Zerika, Jake knew that this was just the beginning of the war. And no matter what it took, he was going to make sure they won. The explosion rocked the ranch with a deafening sound, shaking the ground beneath Jake's feet. Dust and debris filled the air as the blast sent shockwaves across the land. Jake's heart raced as he ducked behind a pile of hay, his breath coming in short gasps. The battle had escalated quickly, and it wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. Zerika moved swiftly beside him, her alien eyes glowing as she scanned the area for more threats. The energy in the air seemed to shift with her every motion, as if the very atmosphere responded to her presence. Despite the chaos, Jake couldn't help but be awed by her power. "We need to move," Zerika said, her voice sharp with urgency. "They'll be bringing in reinforcements soon." Jake nodded. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The enemy ships had launched more troops onto the ground, and their advanced weapons were overwhelming. There was no way they could win this battle with sheer firepower alone. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his hand tightening around the rifle. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Zerika turned to face him, her expression serious. "There's something you need to see, something your grandfather hid here. It's the key to everything. But we need to get to it before they do." Jake's brow furrowed. "What is it? What are we looking for?" Zerika's eyes flickered with something like fear, though she tried to hide it. "It's an artifact, Jake. The last of its kind. My people used it to harness energy, to control the elements and bend reality itself. It's the most powerful thing left from the Saran civilization. And now it's the only thing that can save us." Jake's mind was racing. His grandfather had always kept things hidden from him, things that seemed to make no sense at the time. But now, everything was starting to come together. His grandfather had known about Zerika's people, the Terran. He had known about the artifact. And now Jake was going to be the one to uncover it all. Without another word, they ran through the ranch, ducking behind walls and equipment as enemy fire rained down. The barn had already been hit by several blasts, but the shed at the far end of the property was still standing. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. Jake's breath came in heavy pants, but he didn't stop. They were getting closer to the shed. Just as they reached the door, a loud screech of metal echoed in the air. Jake's eyes went wide as a massive alien warship hovered overhead, its weapons charged and ready to fire. "Move," Zerika shouted, pulling him toward the door. But as she turned the handle, the door exploded inward, sending both of them flying backward. The force of the blast threw them to the ground, and Jake's head slammed against the dirt. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, Zerika was kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Her face was pale, but she didn't seem hurt. She helped him up, her grip firm and steady. "We're not alone," she said, her voice low and tense. Jake stumbled to his feet, shaking off the dizziness. He turned just in time to see a group of soldiers emerge from the wreckage. They were tall, clad in dark armor, and their weapons hummed with deadly energy. These weren't the bounty hunters they had been fighting earlier. These were elite soldiers, sent to finish the job. Zerika stepped in front of Jake, her eyes glowing brightly now, her hands raised as if she were preparing to unleash a wave of energy. But before she could act, a voice rang out from behind the soldiers. Enough. A figure stepped forward, his armor gleaming in the moonlight. His face was obscured by a helmet, but Jake could tell from his posture that this man was no ordinary soldier. There was an air of authority around him, a confidence that made Jake uneasy. Zerika's expression changed, her eyes narrowing. She took a step back, as though recognizing the figure. "You," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "I should have known it was you." The man removed his helmet, revealing a face Jake had never seen before, but immediately recognized. It was a face that had been burned into his memory from old photographs, from stories his grandfather had told him in hushed tones. It was the face of someone who had been close to Eli Dawson. Too close. "Eli didn't tell you about me, did he?" the man asked, his voice smooth and cold. "He was always so protective of you, Jake. So naive." Jake's stomach dropped. This man wasn't just an enemy. He was someone from his grandfather's past, someone who had been hiding in the shadows all along. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice shaking with a mix of confusion and anger. "What do you want?" The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "I'm someone who's been waiting a long time for this moment. Eli's little secret, his precious artifact. It's mine now. And you, Jake, are just in the way." Zerika stepped forward, her hands crackling with energy. "You don't know what you're doing, Rorik," she said, her voice tight with rage. "You can't control it. The artifact is too powerful for you." Rorik's smile only grew wider. "I don't need to control it. I just need it to destroy you." Before Zerika could react, Rorik raised his hand, and the air around them seemed to freeze. A wave of energy surged toward them, a pulse that sent Jake sprawling to the ground. He could barely catch his breath as the force of the blast knocked the wind out of him. Zerika stood her ground, her body glowing as she deflected the blast with a shield of energy. But it was clear that Rorik was too powerful. He had something Jake didn't understand, but it was enough to give him the upper hand. Jake struggled to his feet, his heart pounding. What is that? How is he doing that?" Zerika's face was grim. "He's using the artifact. He's connected to it in ways I never thought possible. I should have known. He was working with them all along." The truth hit Jake like a ton of bricks. Rorik wasn't just some mercenary. He had been part of Eli's world, the world his grandfather had kept hidden from him. And now, that world was collapsing around him. Zerika's face twisted with pain and fury. "You won't win, Rorik. The Tyran were never meant to be controlled, and neither am I." Rorik laughed, a cold, merciless sound. "We'll see about that." Before Jake could fully process the situation, Rorik raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Zerika. Jake acted on instinct, running toward her, but the blast came faster than he could react. It struck Zerika, sending her flying back, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. "No," Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he rushed to her side. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. She was still breathing, but barely. "Zerika," Jake cried, desperation flooding his voice. She opened her eyes, her expression pained but determined. "Get to the artifact, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to stop him, before it's too late." Jake's heart clenched. He knew what he had to do, but the path ahead was clear now. Rorik had betrayed them all, and it was up to Jake to end this once and for all. The battle was over, but the air still felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The ranch, once a place of peace and quiet, was now a battlefield, scared by explosions, fire, and the remnants of the war that had threatened everything Jake had ever known. He stood alone in the silence that followed, the artifact still pulsating faintly in his hands. Zerika had collapsed beside him, her energy drained, and though her wounds had been healed by the artifact's power, it was clear that she wasn't going to be able to recover anytime soon. Her breath was slow, labored, and she was pale, the battle taking its toll on her fragile form. Jake could feel the power of the artifact coursing through him, but it wasn't enough to heal the damage done to their bodies and spirits. It had stopped Rorik, but it hadn't taken away the pain of everything they had lost. His heart ached as he looked at Zerika, the woman who had come into his life like a storm, bringing with her the weight of an entire civilization's survival. "Zerika, please don't leave me," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. He dropped to his knees beside her, the artifact's glow flickering in his hands. Her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her gaze to him, her face weak, but still holding the same quiet strength that had kept them going through the darkest moments of their fight. "I'm not leaving, Jake," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm right here." Jake shook his head. "But you're hurt. You've been through so much. I don't know what to do without you. I can't lose you." Zerika smiled faintly, reaching out to touch his hand. "You won't lose me. I'm part of you now. The bond we share, the artifact, it's more than just power. It's a connection that's deeper than anything you can see or feel. I'll always be with you." Jake's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, but the truth was hard to swallow. She was too weak to stand, her energy spent, and the reality of the fight they had just won still hung heavy in the air. They had defeated Rorik, but the cost had been steep. The war wasn't over, it had only just begun. The artifact might have brought them victory in this moment, but it had also changed everything. "You saved me, you know," Jake said, his voice steadying. He squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the chaos of the aftermath. "You saved us both. I never thought I'd be here, standing like this. I never thought I'd be the one to fight for anything more than a ranch." Zerika's eyes softened. "Jake, you've always been more than just a cowboy. You have the heart of a warrior, even if you didn't know it. Your grandfather saw that in you. He knew you would be the one to carry the burden. And now, you're ready. Ready to protect not just your world, but all of ours." The pain in Jake's chest tightened. He had always admired his grandfather, but he never truly understood the weight of the responsibility his grandfather had carried. The legacy of the Siran people, the artifact, Zerika, it was all far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. But it was his now. The cowboy who had inherited an alien girl was now the protector of two worlds, and he would carry that burden with honor. But the truth still hung heavily over them. Zerika's condition was deteriorating. The artifact had helped her heal, but the energy it had drained from her body was far too much for her to fully recover from. She had given everything to save him, to save their worlds. "No," Jake said, his voice full of resolve. "I won't let you go. Not like this." Zerika shook her head, a faint smile still on her lips. "Jake, listen to me. This is the way it has to be. The artifact's power, it can only keep us alive for so long. The energy I've used to help you, to help us win this battle, is too much for my body. I can't survive it." Jake felt his world shatter. "Please, Zerika, don't do this. We can figure something out. We can." Zerika gently placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. Her eyes were filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "You don't have to do anything, Jake. I've already made my peace. This isn't goodbye. Not really. Our bond, it will never break. It's stronger than anything Rorik or the artifact could ever create. It will last through time." Tears welled in Jake's eyes. He didn't want to lose her. He couldn't imagine a life without her. She had been his guide, his protector, his friend. They had fought together, pulled together, and now it seemed like she was slipping through his fingers. Zerika's hand lifted to his cheek, her touch gentle and loving. "Jake, you'll be fine. You'll carry on the legacy. You'll protect what's left of both our worlds. And when the time comes, you'll make the right choices." Jake couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat, the pain of loss too much to bear. The woman he had come to care for so deeply, the one who had taught him so much about strength and sacrifice, was slipping away. The weight of his responsibilities seemed unbearable, but Zerika had prepared him for this moment. She had always known what needed to be done. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." Zerika's smile was soft, her eyes closing as if she were finally at peace. "Thank you for believing in me, for helping me." And just like that, her body went limp in his arms, the light in her eyes fading away. Jake held her for a long moment, unable to let go, unable to accept the reality of what had just happened. She was gone, and the weight of that loss pressed down on him with the force of 1,000 storms. The wind howled across the field, a mournful cry that seemed to echo Jake's grief. But he knew that he couldn't stay here forever. Zerika had given him the strength to continue, to fight for what was right, even if it meant facing impossible odds. He stood up slowly, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. The battle wasn't over. The artifact was still in his hands, and the future of both his world and Zerika's depended on him. He couldn't afford to fail. As Jake looked around the ranch, now scared by the battle, he knew that things would never be the same. The world had changed, and so had he. But there was one thing that remained certain. He would honor Zerika's sacrifice. He would protect their worlds, and he would carry on the legacy she had left him. With a final, quiet glance at the woman who had given him everything, Jake turned and walked away from the wreckage. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the horizon. A new day had begun, and with it, Jake knew his journey was far from over. He had a duty now, a duty to protect, to fight, and to honor those who had come before him. Zerika's voice echoed in his mind. "You'll be fine. You'll carry on the legacy." And as Jake took the first step toward the unknown, he knew in his heart that he was ready.